Right now I'm engaged in doing a project that I think of as being the final one in my life. I've written maybe 4 or 5 books, but I started thinking not too long ago that my handwriting that once was beautiful had begun to disintegrate. And the time had come to slow down and try and recapture that again. So I'm doing a graphic memoir that's sort of like a comic book. And I was not allowed to read comic books when I was young, so that's also interests me. um, and it's called The Ancestry of Friendship. And it's an attempt to deconstruct the typical notion of what a genealogy is, and yet tell stories that are about my own life and the life of this universe we're all in together. But drawing on actual family stories and stories of people who have been my friends. I grew up in a family that has a lot of paper in it. I mean, generations and generations of people who saved paper and wrote things. And consequently, in my basement, I have boxes and boxes of letters and old diaries and journals and things that belong to other people, and family charts and all that kind of thing, which I don't think of as being particularly interesting in a standard genealogical sort of way. But to back up then a bit, I remember when I was 11 years old and I was driving in a red Rambler from New Jersey up to Vermont with my grandfather, who was a man who wrote fantastic letters from all over the world, from China, where my mother was a little girl, and later from India, places where he was working with the World Council of Churches. And he was very interested in words and talked to me about the meaning of words as we were driving. And I got so excited about that I told him I was going to be a linguist. And he kind of chuckled at that. But it stayed with me, that interest in words, that I think, looking back, was really a major thread in my life as a student, and eventually as a person who wanted to write and did write, have written books of various kinds and also some poetry. The words always also seem to get connected to images. And I noticed that at first when I was in college and wanting to do some work on religious studies, and ended up writing a paper on bull sacrifice in the Old Testament. And then a really curious thing happened. I went home for Christmas vacation my first year, and my parents had uncovered one of those boxes of papers that had belonged to an aunt of mine who died the year I was born, so I never knew her. And she had been a student of Carl Jung's in Switzerland. And I pulled out these papers one after another and thought, this is fascinating material to me, including drawings that she had done of scenes in the Old Testament, just sort of stick figure drawings. And it turns out that as children in the late 1890s, they all were gathered around the fireplace when they were on Sunday afternoons, and their father would read out loud from the Old Testament, and all the children would draw these pictures. And the ones that she was sort of resurrecting for her work on bull sacrifice turned out to be the exact same images that I had been writing about in my paper for religious studies in my first year of college. And so that's a beginning. That's sort of a first, I guess, a first chapter for sort of what began to form my intellectual life. It was part family, part love of words and images, and yeah.
You started with handwriting. How is that important to you?
I started writing papers in high school at a time when the only option was a typewriter or writing by hand. So it was a good 15 years before people started doing word processing. And I noticed that every page that I wrote interested me because of the form itself. I had an aesthetic interest or attachment to the shape of the words on the page. And I thought that my ideas were much more presentable in handwriting than in type. I could type. I took typing. In fact, it was the only D I ever got in high school. But my father was not disappointed because it was a business class, business typing. For some reason that made it, I didn't understand what was happening in that class, but that somehow made it okay. But I didn't type because I was more interested in the product of the handwritten page. Then, once I got to college, I began to write my dreams down in a journal as well. And that has been a long process. I'm still doing it. It's been a long process of development. And there's a slowness to the process of writing something by hand, and there's an embodiedness in it that I feel has the function of centering me while I'm working. So that becomes a morning sort of meditation thing. But so that when I began to notice that my handwriting was disintegrating, it meant a lot more to me than just getting old and older and the handwriting just, not looking as good as it once did. So when I was in graduate school, one of the most important experiences I had was finding a mentor in Norman O. Brown, who was the author of Love's Body, and a classicist who was also really interested in psychoanalysis. And my experience working with him has this interesting chapter in it related to handwriting. I had gone in to speak with him about taking his class on world mythology, and which was a class for undergraduates, though I was there at that time to be a doctoral student in the history of consciousness at Santa Cruz. And he said to me, "Why are you in this class? You're a graduate student." And I explained, yes, I was, but I really wanted to know what it was that he was teaching. So he let me into the class, but he said I could be there if I agreed to be his teaching assistant, which was totally unexpected, but led to a 3-year really critical relationship for me. Then one summer after that, I guess it was after that first year, he came up with the idea of publishing his 5 lectures in a class called To Greet the Return of the Gods. And he knew that in the course of those lectures I had taken very careful notes in the class. And he decided to publish those tapes with a workbook that included in it all of the things that were written, the Latin he wrote on the board, the Greek he wrote on the board, the names of the books, that kind of thing. So he got an advance from his publisher at Random House to pay me to sit in an office that summer and hand write this workbook, which was an incredible experience for me in many ways. One morning I was riding up to campus, and Santa Cruz is an incredible campus of 10,000 acres of redwoods and hills overlooking the ocean, and I had a motorcycle in those days, and was thinking as I was going up the hill, up and up the hill, how the heck am I going to draw the stag's horns that belong to Actaeon in the story of Actaeon spying on the goddess Artemis. And this was so long before you could Google images, and I couldn't spend all my time in the library. I just went to my study. I was thinking, so I'm going up this hill. The sun is behind me, and it casts a shadow on the road that took my breath away, because the mirrors of my motorcycle and the handles and my hands on them shone in such a way that it looked kind of like antlers. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to pay attention to this. And just at that moment, I slowed down to pay attention. Just at that moment, off to my left, on a high rise, a huge stag came out of the woods and was standing there on the hill. And I stopped my motorcycle and looked over there, and then unbelievably, as I'm trying to get the image of these antlers in my head, another horned deer came up and stood right behind it in the morning sun. Amazing experience. So anyway, I went back to my workshop and drew the antlers that day, and had a marvelous summer working on that material, at the end of which Norman O. Brown asked me to take that book to the publisher in New York, because he was not interested in traveling, and my family lived in New Jersey, so I was heading back that direction anyway for a break. I did, and Jason Epstein, who was the editor at that time, publisher, was really interested in the material. But at the meeting, he had called in his head of marketing. So all these men were lined up in this office, smoking cigars. And I came in and presented the material. Fortunately, Navi had written ahead and described everything to them, but they were really wanting to publish it, but they were utterly and totally baffled, because there was no way to market it. They had no idea of how you could package a tape and a written text together. It's like no one had ever done that in publishing. So, it turns out it was about 10 years ahead of its time, but for me it was a really, I guess that's a really important chapter in my interest in handwriting, and then that sort of got, one of the reasons it got buried is because Norman O. Brown showed the work to John Cage, who was a friend of his visiting out in California at the time, and John Cage looked at my manuscript and said that it was too cute. Some of the drawing was too cute, which killed me at the time, and had the effect of just stopping my production of that kind of work. And I guess now it's just in the archives out at Santa Cruz. But anyway, Yeah, the interest in handwriting went underground then, and I started working on other kinds of books that were required my learning how to eventually use a computer. So.
So your family produces a lot of paper, and since it goes back, that means a lot of handwriting. So you've seen a lot. Do you find yourself having, I want to say, cage-like responses to some of it? I mean, do you find yourself saying, this is wonderful, this is too cute, this is very strange? I mean, how is it to read handwriting, or rather to see it?
I'm very interested in it when I see it. I'm never not interested in graphology, particularly that kind of thing, but I like it just purely aesthetically for what it shows me something about the person, you know. But I probably don't read a lot of handwriting intentionally, although I have been looking a lot at comic books and trying to figure out the best way to make a connection between my handwritten words and these little images I'm drawing. It's kind of like my mother said at the end of her life. We were trying to find music to play for her in her room in assisted living, and she loved to sing, and we thought having this great music from the era when she was in her 20s or 30s would be delightful to her. So we got all these CDs and put them on, and she just was bored to death. And finally she allowed us how she was much more interested in singing herself than in having all these other people sing to her. And I think in a way I'm sort of that way with writing too. It's not that I'm as enamored of reading other things in handwriting. It's just I really like to practice it myself. It's like a discipline of some kind. And the papers in my family that interest me are the ones that really tell stories. And for example, there are genealogy charts, the old-fashioned kind, genealogy charts that have they have legends on them. They're almost all for men, which is intriguing, and I've been experimenting with developing legends for women. But for example, there'll be a little tiny scroll that says this person got a diploma at such and such a place, or a military star for having been in service or something. And I enjoy looking at those stories. There's one that has the Star-Spangled Banner, a flag in it for somebody who saw the flag burning when that song was written, and that kind of thing. But yeah, I would like to have charts that show an ink pot and a pen for a woman who was an artist, or a vine for a woman who was an herbalist and grew things in her yard, that kind of thing. So I've been experimenting with developing that in my Ancestry of Friendship project too. So let's see, where was that going? Another thread maybe I'll pick up is teachers have always been really important to me, and when I was out in Santa Cruz, I had another experience of being involved in a church, an Anglican church, where I was given the opportunity to give sermons, and that was actually my first experience sort of giving lectures and presentations. But this church was quite experimental. It was I got to Santa Cruz in 1969, so it was just sort of the height of that kind of ferment going on in California, which extended to not only the schools but also the churches. And I was given the opportunity. I hand wrote the sermons and drew pictures in them, but then I also was given the opportunity to create theater pieces, like an Easter day when everybody came to the church and the doors were locked and they couldn't get in, and I had some women come out of the crowd and go up to the door and bang on the door and say, "Let us in, let us in." And it became a symbol of the closed tomb of Christ, and it was a great time to be in, an experimenting student, I guess is what I would say. And I had lots of opportunity to be creative in places like that. The Santa Cruz, as well as Beloit, where I was an undergraduate, it just so happened that all the time I was in school, college and graduate school, corresponded to a time in the history of education in this country where a lot of schools weren't even giving grades. Everything was so, we had narrative evaluations and that kind of thing, and so it was, in some ways it was kind of a wild time, but it worked well for me because I had no idea what I wanted to do, really, except to continue these projects and things that interested me. And when I got closer to the time of graduating from Santa Cruz, Navi asked me after my orals, which I will say something about in a second, but what I thought I wanted to do. And I said I really had no idea, and I was actually getting a little bit scared about that, because if I had been born a generation, 2 generations earlier, I know I would have been a missionary or something, like other really intrepid women in my family who went to other countries and were teachers. But I didn't want to do that, and I didn't want to join the Peace Corps. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but he sort of laughed at my anxiety, which was okay. And I ended up leaving there and coming to the Twin Cities. And the reason I did come to the Twin Cities is partly related to that church experience I was describing earlier. There was a priest from the Twin Cities who was doing a bus trip all around the United States in quadrants, and he had already done a couple, and the next one was going to be in the Southwest. And he and whoever was on the bus went around and parked the bus in communes in order to study the relationship between the ideals of the contemporary commune movement and medieval monasticism, which interested him a lot. So I heard about this guy, priest named William Teska, who lived in the Twin Cities, from a bishop in the Anglican Church who had just been exiled for opposing apartheid in South Africa. He was an intriguing guy, and he heard about some things that I was interested in and said, "Why don't you call this person in Minnesota?" So I did. And I managed to get money from the vice president, the academic vice president at Santa Cruz, to help fund the bus trip, and went and joined this sort of Ken Kesey style bus in Colorado, and embarked on a 6-week trip with these guys who were, it was the priest and 3 musicians from the Riverside Cafe, well actually 2 musicians from the Riverside Cafe on the West Bank, and one guy who was a kind of iron worker, which is fascinating because the last book I wrote was about irons. I mean, all these things do get connected. But they had remade the inside of the school bus, so there were 4 bunk beds. There were 5 of us and a dog. And they were very gentlemanly and took turns sleeping on the floor so I could have a bunk. But we all traveled together in the back of this bus and went and parked in really interesting communes like New Buffalo outside of Taos and the Lama Foundation and various places. And then Tesca and I would go interview everybody and ask them about, well, we asked them about their theology, but not many of them were so articulate about that, but they were really had a lot to say about why they wanted to be there, what they were doing. So I ended up deciding to do a doctoral dissertation on the meaning of liturgics, or the work of the voice of the people in community, and design it as a case study looking at what was happening in the Twin Cities in the early 70s. And come here and live in a commune with this priest and some other people that had a house in town and then a farm out in the country in Wisconsin. And so I came here then and was really interested in poetry community and other kinds of thinking groups. Like I got involved with teaching at the, what was it called, the free school then, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that takes you to about when we met.
About, yeah.
It would be about 78.
Uh-huh.
One strand in all this is of personal interest, so I want to ask about it. I know that in the course of your life you've done a lot of talking in contexts in which people are very likely to take you seriously. I know, just because of this thing you're talking about, the audience, the relationship established. I've seen it happen. How was preaching for you? As a specific way of speaking to people, how did that work for you?
That's such a good question. I went for a walk once with Norman O'Brown, and he knew I was doing this preaching gig at the Anglican Church, and he commented about my writing at the time and said, it might be a good idea for me to learn how to make a point without having to establish a moral conclusion. Yeah. And it just, yeah, it was exactly right. Oh gosh. He was so good at doing that to me. So I mean, the actual preaching experience probably, that lasted for about 6 months or something. But when I came here, I took a class at the University of Minnesota Extension taught by Marianne Mattoon, who at the time was the only Jungian analyst in the Midwest, which is like incomprehensible now. And it was on the feminine. And I had been doing a lot of reading of what Jungians had written in that area already. And I went to that class and I asked a lot of questions. And finally she asked me to please stop asking questions and had me stay after class. And she said that it was clear that I, had a big interest in this and knew something about it, and would I like to teach the class the next time it was taught because she was going to be away on sabbatical or something and all that. So it ended up being really a great opportunity for me. So that was how I started teaching in the Twin Cities. But every time I worked on a talk, I mean a class, it really became a talk, and each talk kind of became a chapter of a book. So I was still quite maybe long-winded and dense in the material I was bringing together. But so yeah, the question of having people pay attention to what I'm saying. I did always want to be academic and thorough, but at the same time personal. So really wanted to find a way to relate what I was thinking about and putting together in mythology, for example, so that it would strike a chord in the people who were listening. Yeah. But I think I still struggle. I mean, I still struggle with that. Yeah, the question of the appended moral.
The amount of bad preaching that would be removed from the world if that sentence could be said to every beginning preacher is staggering. It's greater than the mass of the earth. I also suspect very strongly that in his later days, Joseph took Jesus into a walk in the woods and said, you know, your stuff would be better if you didn't keep attaching a moral.
Right, and also if you could inject a little humor,
Yeah,
which is very helpful. Yeah.
I mean, you opened the door. Do you incline to be a moralist?
No, I just really am driven by wanting things to matter and find meaning. I mean, it's even though I am very fully capable, sort of believe in negative capability, and ambivalence, and but despite my protestations, yeah, I don't know if it's moral, Peter. Or if it's just the earnestness of meaning,
Well, the way it always comes to me is the question, if I'm preaching, how exact... It's fairly clear that if I'm preaching, I'm attempting to help people.
Uh-huh.
Perhaps if I'm teaching, I'm not. I mean, if I'm teaching, people may be there for all kinds of reasons. They may be shopping for a major or a piece of life that they can connect to, and I shall have the Socrates booth the way the guy at the state fair has the extra sharp Swedish knife booth. And if they don't want it, that's probably just as well. They would cut themselves.
Yeah.
But when I talk to a congregation, I care about people in such a way that I want to help them. But the question is, what is that helping relation?
Yeah.
And I'm curious how you think, in speaking in that kind of way, perhaps not just in a church, how you want to help.
I'm also, now a grandmother of 14 children. And I am so aware of the value of listening. And rather than saying this is how I did it and how it should be done, for example, but oh gosh, there are so many ways of helping. There really are, and I've often said that I believe in the metaphor of resurrection, and yet I don't want to posit light at the end of the tunnel necessarily, which to me means I want to be able to be alongside people going through the dark without saying there is going to be this light at the end of the tunnel, because I don't really know. So I think there's a way of helping, being helpful by being a witness. With the grandchildren, though, there's a lot of pressure when things are difficult to want to fix them, of course, and I'm more prone to do that, I think, with my people in my family than I am with my friends who are peers, and or with people when I was working, as I did for many years, as a psychotherapist, where it was really important not to know, to have confidence that something would happen next, but not to posit happiness, So helping, the question of helping has been really, after all, I've been in the helping professions for so many years, But it was good 15 years ago to make the segue into being a dramaturg, which is one of the things I call myself now, working with theater, because there it's really death to a show if it moves into the appended moral, as we were talking about, I think. But I've always felt the opposing. There's the preacher, and there's the phenomenologist, and they really come at things a little differently. And the phenomenologist is wanting to see things as they are and describe them. Gets connected to poetry too.
Well, it's kind of surprising. I think I could, in my own experience, I think I could come out more safely as a nudist than as a preacher. People who follow the twists and turns of one's peculiarity and say, well, that's all right, and that's all right, often don't make that particular turn with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for just this reason, that when they think about preaching and certain other kinds of speech, they think about the lack of accompaniment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They think about the from the top down relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's so interesting to me, kind of how people who respect that relationship think about it.
Yeah. For me, one of the things that was given is the chance to subvert preaching as practiced because of the times, and women weren't supposed to be doing it anyway in Anglo-Catholic churches. But So I had sort of a feminist kind of thing happening. But still, it was trying to get a point across that to a captive audience. HD said that she wanted to speak to a congregation whose reality was myth, and I loved that. That really began to inform my teaching practice. I think after I began doing work in psychotherapy and all that. So then I had to teach mythology in order to get that, to develop a common language with people I was hanging out with and writing for, I guess. And all along my writing, my thinking, my conversation for all these years has been greatly informed by the daily practice of recording my dreams. And dreams are really interesting in terms of what we're talking about, because they don't preach. They don't even have conclusions. Well, sometimes they do, but and yet they really seem to get at the essence of how we're experiencing life. So that's been a really important thread.
I just spoke to a young novelist the other day who was upset because she wasn't remembering her dreams. She said, everything good in my novels comes from my dreams. This relation is disrupted and I can't write, or I can't write anything good. Is there a way in which one can do something like dream for other people? I mean, could you ever imagine doing a sermon that would be telling a dream?
Oh, sure. That wouldn't be difficult in a way for me, but I don't know. Yeah. You mean to inspire people to their own dreaming, and presumably that's in terms of that story.
Well, I just mean you've characterized your own dreams as having this kind of function of being helpful and at the same time not appending a moral.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if something like the relating of a dream is the sort of thing that can be useful to other people.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know how true it is that it actually is boring to listen to other people talk about their dreams for some curious reason. But what is not boring is if someone is talking to you in such a way that they remind you of your own dreaming being. So you get hooked into them at a place where there's a kind of mutual inspiration. That's never boring. But that's a really different thing than saying, oh, last night I had this dream and this is what happened in it, Yeah.
I'm recalling the one talk of yours I ever heard, which was about the Villa of Mysteries, the Twinsy Friends meeting house one night, and the dreams I had afterwards, which for some reason I remember, and this is now, what, going on 40 years later.
Yeah.
And, you know, I have no idea what they meant, but you had this this sort of ship underwater with trees growing, something like that tree actually, growing with the roots growing through the bottom of the ship into the water. And I think, where did that come from? And one thing I'm sure of is it didn't come from, there was nothing in my repertoire before I heard your talk that would have given me that.
Yeah.
And it was a very odd experience to have somebody, I mean, to dream about what someone talked about is not strange.
Right.
To have something quite different from the content of the talk emerge.
That's fascinating.
That was interesting.
Yeah. Very interesting. Well, I wonder if I began it with, I don't think so though, with a wonderful quote from Charles Olson about words, back to words and linguistics, language, and where he was talking about etymology and said he wanted you to pull the word out by its roots and let the roots and the dirt on them dangle. So it's like you get so much more that way. So I think that's a great example. Jungians always talk about the sea as the unconscious, and there you are with these roots going down, the tree going down through the ship. Yeah.
Well, this actually leads to something about your written things and the things you're writing now. I mean, one knows about writing coming out of inner necessity. Mm-hmm. And then there's also the fact that it usually, or very often, is published and is thought about as publishable from the beginning, which means it's thought about as for somebody.
Yeah.
And as being helpful, useful, of interest, not boring to somebody else. And I'm curious how that works for you, or how that's working with this next thing, this thing that you're writing right now, which is a very personal piece.
Yeah. Well, it is and it isn't. Let's see. So the first thing I wrote, The Moon and the Virgin, and that was really for women. That was like in the, anyway, very interesting for a lot of women at that time who were trying to find alternate ways to be who they were. And then I wrote Brood Males, a book about men imitating pregnancy and childbirth. That was sort of anthropological. And then Those Women, which was the one about Pompeii. And again, that was for women in midlife, I guess I would say that. And then the book called Irons in the Fire, which was really written for artists who were casting their own hot metal, and that was written at the invitation of somebody to talk to an international gathering of cast iron artists. But by then I started getting more interested in art. I was working in theater, and I wrote a chapbook called Traces that was part of a performance piece that I did with an installation artist and a photographer. So again, more into the art world. This thing, the Ancestry of Friendship, and the handwritten project and doing the graphic essay, it does have a lot of actual information in it from my own family tree and ancestry, but it's done in such a story-based way and non-sequential way, with stories grouped around the question of how how my life intersects with other lives, particularly of friends, because I'm asking the question in this piece about how we are all related to each other based on the belief that if we talk for long enough, we find really intense points of connection that are sometimes literally ancestral or geographical in some way, or we have some ideal lineage in common, or because I'm really trying to expand the notions of ancestry and lineage and genealogy to be non-literal. Consequently, on one page, I'll have each page stands alone, the way I was describing before when I started doing reports by hand. But each one tells the story of my connection to another person, and maybe how we have in common the myth of Demeter and Persephone, or some. It's so hard to describe this, but the audience really does matter to me in this one as well as the other ones I've written, even though it sounds so obscure. I think that, for example, I've got 21 of these pages now done and up in an art exhibition in Santa Barbara, and I hear from people that they go by and they do stand and spend a long time reading each page because there is so much information on it, and it's not, and people can find themselves in the information that's showing up on the page. It's not just my family story. It's very hard to describe and probably doesn't make sense, but the way what you were asking is definitely relevant to me. And I don't know whether it's in what form it would be publishable, maybe someday, but that right now that's not the primary motive, as has been the case with the other books I wrote. Was always sort of towards a publication,
So what I'm hearing is the idea of, partly the idea of showing people how to find common ground, or what it's like to find common ancestry with someone with whom one might initially not have a reason to expect a connection.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. But then there are these strange things that happen. I met a woman who, we were both talking about our love of books and writing, and we both had grandfather's studies that meant a lot to us when we were little, and we used to sit in his big leather overstuffed chair or play under his library table. And this was a woman I'd only met for, just a little bit of time, but we had this image in common, and the longer we talked, it turns out her grandfather was William Dean Howells, who was a great American man of letters, but he, in her family, and my great grandfather were both working as editors of the Chicago Tribune at the same time when Abraham Lincoln's 3-minute, incredibly famous speech was first published. So after talking to each other for about an hour, we found this actual place of connection where we felt like friends and we had something connected. And turns out our great-grandfathers were literally probably had offices right next door to each other. So we weren't literally related, but we're so deeply related. And that's the kind of connection that fascinates me, and I think is there with all of us if we just have long enough to talk to each other. So it's that kind of thing I'm trying to convey in this book.
Well, I go back to the story with the bull.
With the
bull.
The bull.
I mean,
yeah,
that's downright spooky.
spooky.
So, I have to ask. I mean, how spooky has your life been? I mean, this story is the story you just told is probably a 7 on the scale, in which the bull story is a 10. On
Yes, right.
I mean, it's like so.
Well, you would probably say every page of this book has a spook factor, but for example, being related to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and there's just these things I've found and then my own work on feminist stuff and all that. So, but it's because the family kept all these papers and told these stories, I think, that I'm able to find these things. The spook factor is pretty intriguing to me, and that it somehow happens on the same level as the dreaming. I believe that if you just keep going down there, you can find those channels.
Well, I mean, another thing in your story that I'm curious about, and maybe it's too simple a question by far, but you're working with all of this multicultural, anthropologically rich, artistically and imagistically rich material. You also have in your story connections to particular congregations and particular religious enterprises. And you have in your life this sometimes something that sounds a whole lot like an illustration of he's got the whole world in his hands, like it's not quite Joan of Arc with St. Margaret showing up, but it comes a little bit close. So how do you come around? How do you get your head around kind of the religiosity of life? I mean, how do you think of yourself vis-a-vis people who would say very straightforwardly that he's got at least my whole life in his hands?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I remember in the little Methodist church I went to when I was a kid, the minister brought in once this yoke, this huge wooden object that looked like a giant pair of glasses to me, and he asked what we thought it was, and the children were all supposed to answer, and I thought it looked like a giant pair of glasses, but it turns out it was a yoke, and that he was talking about the word religion meant something like being yoked to God, and then later on I found out that it was the root of the word yoga or for something like that kind of union or connection, which made more sense to me. But I guess, it's E.M. Forster, only connect, everything is connected, and that is the basis of my religiosity, I guess, and does motivate a lot of what I do in my writing, personal relationships, family. I'm interested in those connections and want to foster them in my imagination and actually